when an empath walks away, the first thing that collapses is not the relationship. It is the supply. And we need to understand what that word really means. Supply is not affection. It is not romance. It is not even attachment in the healthy sense. Supply is psychological oxygen. It is the steady stream of validation, attention, emotional reassurance, and energetic presence that keeps the narcissistic personality structure intact. You see, beneath grandiosity, there is fragility. Beneath superiority, there is shame. And beneath control, there is fear. A fear so old and so deeply wired into the nervous system that the person themselves may not consciously recognize it. In many cases, this structure was built early in life. A child who could not rely on safe, attuned connection learned instead to construct an image. A self that would be admired, needed envied, or feared. That image became protection. The empath almost unknowingly feeds that image. Empath almost unknowingly feeds that image. Tate, they anticipate needs. They regulate emotional tension in the room. They sense shifts in mood before words are spoken. In a relationship with a narcissistic personality, this becomes profoundly stabilizing. The empath soothes the unspoken insecurities. They reassure the inflated self. They absorb projections. They tolerate emotional volatility. And most importantly, they stay. So long as the empath remains engaged, even in conflict, the narcissistic system feels safe because attention, even negative attention, confirms significance. But when the empath walks away with clarity, something different happens. There is no dramatic fight to feed on, no emotional explosion to reassert dominance, no pleading, no chasing, no argument, just absence. And that absence is destabilizing. Without supply, the internal emptiness that has been carefully managed begins to surface. This emptiness is not boredom. It is not simple loneliness. It is a dysregulated state in the nervous system, a collapse of the external scaffolding that held the fragile self together. The admiration that once soothed insecurity is gone. The constant emotional mirroring that reinforced identity is gone. The empath's stabilizing presence is gone. What remains is silence, and in that silence, unresolved shame starts to whisper. Many narcissistic individuals will immediately attempt to replace the supply. They may reach out to former partners, intensify social media performance, or quickly entangle themselves with someone new. But this urgency is not love. It is panic regulation. It is an attempt to quiet the rising anxiety that says, without external validation, who am I? The empath's departure forces a confrontation with that question. This is why the narcissist often experiences the empath's exit as betrayal, even if they were the one who devalued or discarded. The empath was never just a partner. They were a regulator. They were a mirror. They were the emotional infrastructure supporting the false self. When that infrastructure is removed, the system trembles. From the outside, it may look like indifference. On the inside, it often feels like fragmentation. Irritability increases. Grandiosity may spike as a defensive maneuver. Or there may be sudden withdrawal and collapse. What we are witnessing is not heartbreak in the conventional sense. It is the destabilization of an identity that depended on another person's emotional labor to survive. And here is the deeper tragedy. The narcissist rarely understands this consciously. They experience the discomfort but lack the insight to connect it to the loss of supply. So instead of reflection, they seek replacement. Instead of introspection, they double down on image. But the original source, the empath who truly saw them, who invested deeply, who tolerated more than most, cannot simply be replicated. And at some level, they know that. So when an empath walks away, the narcissist's psychological hell does not begin with revenge or regret. It begins with exposure. Exposure to the emptiness that was always there, now without distraction. Because when the supply disappears, the mask has nothing left to feed on. If the first collapse is the loss of supply, the second is even more destabilizing. It is the shattering of control. Control for the narcissistic personality is not simply about power over another person. It is about emotional survival. When your internal world feels unpredictable, when shame, inadequacy, and fear threaten to surface. You learn to manage the external world with precision. You manage perceptions, you manage narratives, you manage people, and in intimate relationships. Control often operates subtly. It may show up as charm, strategic affection, withdrawal, criticism, triangulation, or silence. These are not random behaviors. They are regulatory strategies. They keep the other person slightly off balance, slightly seeking approval, slightly uncertain. That uncertainty creates leverage. The empath, because of their depth and emotional availability, often becomes deeply invested. They try harder. They communicate more. They reflect, adjust, compromise. And without realizing it, they enter a dynamic where the narcissist sets the emotional temperature. As long as the empath remains engaged, even in pain, the narcissist feels powerful because engagement signals influence. It confirms, I still matter enough to move you. But when the empath walks away calmly, something unprecedented happens. There is no emotional chaos to dominate, no argument to win, no reaction to manipulate. The script collapses. And this is where the real psychological rupture occurs. The narcissistic structure depends on predictability. It depends on knowing that if I withdraw, you will chase. If I criticize, you will prove yourself. If I threaten to leave, you will panic. These patterns create a sense of mastery over the relational field. It is an illusion, but it feels stabilizing. When the empath breaks that pattern, not with rage, not with revenge, but with clarity, the illusion fractures. Because now the narcissist is no longer the orchestrator. They are the one who has been left, and this reversal is intolerable. It is important to understand that the distress here is not about love in the traditional sense. It is about the loss of dominance. It's when someone you believed was emotionally dependent on you demonstrates independence. It challenges the very narrative you've constructed about yourself. You are no longer the irresistible one. You are no longer the superior one. You are no longer in control. That realization strikes at the core of the narcissistic defense. Often what follows is an attempt to reassert control. Hoovering messages, sudden vulnerability, anger, smear campaigns, public displays of happiness. These are not random reactions. They are efforts to restore psychological equilibrium by regaining influence over the empathist's emotional state, because even a negative reaction would confirm relevance. But when the empath remains grounded and unmoved, the narcissist encounters something profoundly disorienting: powerlessness. And powerlessness, especially for someone whose early life may have been marked by helplessness, is terrifying. It reactivates old wounds, moments when control was absent, when emotional needs were unmet, when safety was uncertain. The adult personality has spent years constructing armor to avoid that vulnerability. The empath's departure pierces it. There is also a philosophical dimension here. Control is an illusion we all cling to in different ways. But in narcissistic dynamics, it becomes central to identity. I control, therefore I am. When that control dissolves, the sense of self trembles. This is why the empath's quiet departure can haunt the narcissist more than dramatic confrontation ever could. Drama allows for engagement. Silence denies it. Indifference is the ultimate loss of control. And so the psychological hell deepens. Not because the empath attacked, because they sought revenge, but because they reclaimed autonomy. And in doing so, they exposed a truth the narcissistic structure cannot tolerate. That real power was never control over another. It was the capacity to walk away. When control shatters, the illusion of superiority shatters with it. And what remains is the unbearable realization that influence without authenticity is emptiness disguised as strength. If the loss of supply creates emptiness and the loss of control creates destabilization, what follows is something even more penetrating. It is what psychology calls a narcissistic injury. But that phrase hardly captures the depth of it. A narcissistic injury is not a wounded ego in the ordinary sense. It is not simply feeling rejected or embarrassed. It is a direct blow to the defensive structure that has been built, often since childhood, to protect against unbearable shame. At the core of narcissistic adaptation lies a hidden belief. If I am not superior, admired, desired, or needed, then I am nothing. That belief is rarely conscious. It operates in the background, shaping behavior, driving ambition, fueling comparison. The grandiosity we see on the surface is not confidence. It is compensation. So when the empath walks away, especially after having seen the narcissist deeply, the injury cuts in a very specific way. The injury cuts in a very specific way because the empath did not leave blindly. They did not leave because they failed to understand. They left after seeing through the mask. And that is what makes it devastating. The empath often sees both sides, the charm and the insecurity, the charisma and the fragility. They may have even loved both. But when they reach the point of clarity and decide, calmly, I will no longer participate in this, the message lands with enormous psychological weight. It says, without cruelty, I see who you are, and I choose not to stay. For someone organized around maintaining an idealized self-image, that is not just rejection, it is exposure. The narcissistic system can tolerate criticism from enemies. It can tolerate envy from rivals. It can even tolerate abandonment from those deemed inferior. But it struggles profoundly with being left by someone who genuinely understood them. Because now the defensive narrative begins to crack. The mind may respond with rage. They were ungrateful. Or dismissal. They were never that important. Or distortion. They were the toxic one. These cognitive maneuvers serve a purpose. They protect against the deeper feeling underneath. The resurgence of early shame. And shame, unlike guilt, does not say, I did something wrong. It says, there is something wrong with me. It says, there is something wrong with me. That is the wound the narcissistic personality has spent a lifetime avoiding. When the empath departs without drama, without begging, without returning to repair what was broken, it activates this buried shame. It confronts the narcissist with a possibility they cannot easily deflect, that someone who offered genuine depth and presence decided they were not safe, not accountable, not capable of mutual love. This realization does not integrate easily. It lingers. It replays in quiet moments. It intrudes when the next relationship does not feel as stabilizing. It whispers during successes that feel strangely hollow. Because the narcissistic structure resists vulnerability, the injury does not heal through reflection. It calcifies. It becomes resentment, obsession, a need to prove superiority elsewhere, or an intensified pursuit of admiration to drown out the echo of that departure. But the echo remains. In many cases, the empath represented something rare, someone who offered attunement without envy, care without competition, love without manipulation, love without manipulation. Losing that does not simply bruise the ego. It destabilizes the illusion that such love was replaceable. And here is the paradox. The narcissist may never consciously admit the injury. They may appear triumphant, indifferent, even relieved. But psychologically, the blow is registered at a much deeper level, at the level where identity and worth were fused together long ago. The empath's exit becomes a mirror that cannot be easily shattered. It reflects a truth the defenses cannot fully erase. That admiration can be performed, control can be exerted, supply can be replaced, but being truly known and still chosen is rare. And when that is lost, something fundamental fractures. A narcissistic injury is not loud. It is quiet and persistent. It is the subtle awareness that someone saw behind the mask and walked away anyway. Dan, that is a wound no performance can fully conceal. And then we come to something even more subtle and perhaps even more unsettling for the narcissistic psyche, the mirror effect. Every intimate relationship functions, in part, as a mirror. We discover who we are in the presence of another. Their reactions, their eyes, their responses reflect something back to us. For a person with a stable internal sense of self, that mirror is informative but not defining. For someone organized around a fragile or fragmented identity, that mirror becomes essential. The empath, by nature, is an unusually clear mirror. Tense pay attention. They listen beneath words. They register micro-expressions, tonal shifts, emotional undercurrents. They often understand what the other person is feeling before that person consciously does. In a healthy dynamic, this creates deep connection. In a narcissistic dynamic, it creates something more complicated, because the empath doesn't just reflect admiration. They reflect truth, the beginning of the relationship. That reflection feels intoxicating to the narcissist. The empath sees their strengths, their charisma, their potential. They validate the grandiose self-image. The mirror shines brightly, and the narcissistic structure feels reinforced. But as time passes, the empath begins to see inconsistencies. They notice the gaps between words and actions. They sense the insecurity beneath the arrogance, the fear beneath the control, the shame beneath the defensiveness. And often they try to respond with compassion. They try to love not only the image, but the wounded core underneath. Here is where the mirror becomes dangerous, because to be truly seen is both beautiful and terrifying. For someone whose personality has been organized around avoiding shame, being seen in depth activates vulnerability. The narcissistic defense was designed to prevent precisely this exposure. Yet the empath, simply by being attuned, reflects it back. Sometimes the narcissist responds by devaluing the empath, criticizing them, accusing them of being too sensitive or too emotional. This is not random cruelty. It is an attempt to distort the mirror. If the mirror can be discredited, its reflection loses power. But when the empath eventually walks away, the mirror disappears entirely, and this absence has a peculiar psychological effect. While the empath was present, even conflict provided reflection. There was feedback. There was emotional engagement. There was someone actively responding to the narcissist's inner world. With the empath gone, that reflective surface is removed. Now there is only the self, unmirrored, unsoftened, unvalidated. For a stable identity, solitude can foster growth. For a fragile one, it can feel like dissolution. Without the empath's gaze, the narcissistic individual loses the external confirmation that held their self-image together. Because the empath had seen beyond the surface, their departure carries an implicit message. I saw you clearly. That message lingers. The new supply may admire. They may flatter. They may idealize, but they often do not see in the same way. They reflect the surface, not the depth. And so, even if the narcissist feels temporarily validated, there is an unconscious awareness that the deeper mirror, the one that recognized both strength and shadow, is gone. This is profoundly destabilizing, because somewhere beneath the defenses, there is a human being who longs to be known. The tragedy of narcissistic adaptation is that the strategies developed to avoid shame also block authentic connection. The empath briefly offered the possibility of being seen and still accepted. Tasked, when that possibility leaves, it reactivates an old grief. Not necessarily the grief of losing a partner, but the grief of losing a mirror that reflected both the false self and the wounded, true self underneath. And in the quiet that follows, there is no one left to project onto, no one left to correct the image, no one left to correct the image, no one left to stabilize the reflection. There is only the raw confrontation with one's own interior world. The mirror take is not about punishment. It is about exposure. Torment. The next, when the empath walks away, the narcissist is left alone with the only reflection that cannot be manipulated. The one inside. And that reflection, unfiltered and unflattered, is the one they have spent a lifetime trying not to see. And after the injury, after the shattered control, after the silence of the missing mirror, something almost predictable happens. The narcissistic system searches for replacement. On the surface, it can look effortless. A new relationship appears quickly. Photo surface. There is laughter, intensity, declarations of connection to the outside world, and sometimes even to the empath watching from a distance. It may seem as though nothing was lost at all, but psychologically something very different is unfolding, because replacement supply is not the same as irreplaceable connection. When we talk about supply, we are speaking about regulation, about the external soothing of an unstable inner world. A new person can provide attention, they can provide admiration, they can provide novelty, which in itself is stimulating to the nervous system. Novelty temporarily quiets anxiety because it floods the system with dopamine. It feels like relief. The empath offered something far more complex. They offered sustained attunement They endured contradictions. They attempted understanding where others might have walked away sooner. They saw patterns over time. They tolerated emotional volatility. And importantly, they often loved in a way that was patient and psychologically invested. That kind of connection creates a certain imprint. When the narcissist moves on quickly, it is not necessarily because they feel nothing. It is often because they feel too much destabilization. The urgency to secure new supply is an attempt to restore equilibrium. If someone new desires me, then I am still valuable. If someone admires me, then I am still superior. If someone needs me, then I am still in control. Internally, comparison begins almost immediately. Not consciously at first, it may show up as subtle irritation. The new partner does not anticipate emotional shifts in the same way. They may not tolerate the same behavior. They may not offer the same depth of reflection. Or perhaps they idealize too easily without truly seeing. And here lies the paradox. The narcissistic structure craves admiration, but it is strangely haunted by authenticity. The empath represented both. They admired, but they also perceived. They loved, but they also questioned. That combination is rare. When the new supply fails to recreate that psychological balance, something feels off. The intention might be there. The attention might be there. The attention might be there. The stabilizing quality, the quiet emotional intelligence that once regulated chaos is missing. Regulated chaos is missing. And so dissatisfaction creeps in. This dissatisfaction is rarely acknowledged directly. Instead, it may transform into restlessness, increased need for external validation, escalation of drama, or a subtle longing that the narcissist cannot fully name. Because what was lost was not just attention. It was familiarity at a deep psychological level. The empath had learned the rhythm of the narcissist's inner world. They could predict the shifts. They knew when insecurity was hiding beneath anger. They knew when withdrawal masked fear. That attunement provided unconscious stability. Without it, relationships feel more volatile, more superficial, more effortful. And this is why, even when surrounded by new admirers, the narcissist can feel strangely empty. The external performance continues. The image is maintained, but the internal comparison persists. Not necessarily because they miss the empath as a person in a romantic sense, but because they miss the regulation, the depth, the sense of being known, even if that knowledge felt threatening. At times, the tragedy is that instead of integrating this awareness, the narcissistic system often doubles down. More charm, more conquest, more validation, as if quantity can replace quality. But psychologically, it cannot, because depth leaves an imprint that novelty cannot erase. And so the quiet torment continues, not dramatic, not always visible, but persistent. A subtle awareness that something substantial was lost, that not all supply is equal, that not all mirrors reflect with clarity, that not all connections stabilize the same way. When an empath walks away, replacement may be immediate, but replication is impossible. And the deeper the original connection, the more unmistakable that truth becomes. You can replace attention, you can replace admiration, but you cannot replace being deeply known. And once that has been lost, every substitute carries the echo of what it is not. And beneath all of this, beneath the search for replacement, beneath the performance of indifference, there is something even more fundamental happening. The nervous system begins to destabilize. Don't talk about this enough. We tend to frame narcissistic dynamics in purely moral terms. Who was right? Who was wrong? Who hurt whom? But at a deeper level, we are looking at patterns of emotional regulation. And for many narcissistic individuals, regulation has always been external. In early development, a child learns to regulate the stress through attuned caregivers, a soothing voice, a consistent presence, emotional mirroring. These experiences shape the nervous system. Emotional mirroring. These experiences shape the nervous system. When that attunement is inconsistent, shaming, or absent, the child adapts. Some collapse inward. Others build defenses outward. Narcissistic traits often emerge as a way of managing overwhelming vulnerability. Grandiosity, control, perfectionism. These are not just personality features. They are regulatory strategies. Now enter the empath. Empaths are often highly attuned regulators. They sense tension quickly. They soften conflict. They reassure. They anticipate emotional needs before they are spoken. In relationships with narcissistic personalities, this becomes stabilizing in a profound way. The empath absorbs volatility. They calm rage. They repair ruptures. They carry emotional weight that is not fully theirs. Without necessarily realizing it, the narcissistic individual begins to rely on this. When anger rises, the empathy de-escalates. When insecurity surfaces, the empathy escalates. When chaos brews, the empathy steadies. When chaos brews, the empathy steadies. This dynamic can persist for years, and because it becomes normalized, its importance is underestimated. But when the empathy walks away, that regulatory buffer disappears overnight. Suddenly, the narcissistic individual is alone with emotional states they have long outsourced. Irritability intensifies. Small frustrations feel disproportionate. There may be sudden mood swings, bursts of rage, or unexpected collapses into lethargy. Impulsivity can increase. Risky decisions, reactive communication, dramatic gestures. From the outside, it may look like anger at the empath. Internally, it is dysregulation. The nervous system, which had adapted to relying on an external stabilizer, is now scrambling. And because self-reflection is often limited in narcissistic structures, the discomfort is rarely interpreted accurately. Instead of recognizing, I feel destabilized because I lost someone who regulated me, the mind seeks blame. They caused this. They abandoned me. They were disloyal. Blame restores temporary coherence. It avoids the more threatening realization. I do not know how to soothe myself. This is the deeper psychological consequence of the empath departure. It is not only about ego, it is about emotional infrastructure. It is not only about ego, it is about emotional infrastructure. The empath functioned as part of the narcissist's regulatory system. And here lies the irony. The very traits that may have been dismissed, sensitivity, emotional depth, patience, were the traits that kept the system stable. Once removed, the internal chaos becomes more visible. Some narcissistic individuals respond by escalating control in other areas: career, social status, physical appearance. Others may seek intense stimulation to distract from internal discomfort, but without genuine internal regulation skills, these efforts provide only temporary relief. The empath's absence exposes a developmental gap. To be clear, this does not excuse harmful behavior, but it helps us understand the mechanism when someone has not developed the capacity to sit with shame, fear, or vulnerability without external reinforcement. The loss of a regulating partner can feel like psychological freefall. And this is part of the hell that begins. 'Cause now the discomfort cannot be projected as easily. It cannot be soothed as quickly. It cannot be soothed as quickly. It cannot be stabilized through familiar patterns. The system is left to confront its own fragility. To the empath, walking away often brings clarity and gradual healing. For the narcissistic individual, it often brings intensification of anger, restlessness, dissatisfaction, of anger, restlessness, dissatisfaction. What was once externally managed must now be internally faced. And until that capacity is developed, until self-regulation replaces control, until accountability replaces blame, the instability continues. Tears. It is not just love that is lost. It is the emotional scaffolding that kept the inner chaos from spilling over, and without that scaffolding, the storm inside has nowhere left to hide. And then something paradoxical begins to happen. After the anger, after the replacement, after the attempts to reassert control, an obsession can take root. This is the stage many people misunderstand. They assume that if the narcissist reaches out repeatedly, checks social media, asks mutual friends about the empath, or suddenly reappears with intense emotion, it must mean they're in love. But what we're observing here is not love in the mature sense. It is fixation born from wounded identity. Remember what has already occurred. The supply was removed. Control was shattered. The injury was inflicted. The mirror disappeared. Regulation destabilized. Each of these experiences chips away at the narcissistic defense structure. And when a structure built on superiority encounters undeniable loss, the psyche looks for restoration. Obsession becomes an attempt at restoration. Because the empath did something psychologically disruptive, they left without collapsing. They left without begging. They left without returning to repair what they did not break. And perhaps most threatening of all, they left after seeing clearly. That clarity is intolerable. For someone organized around maintaining an inflated self-image, being fully seen and then rejected creates cognitive dissonance. If I am superior, how could they leave? If I am irresistible, how could they detach? The mind circles these questions, not to understand them deeply, but to neutralize them. And so the empath becomes a psychological puzzle that must be solved. Sometimes the obsession appears as hoovering, messages framed as apologies, nostalgia, or sudden insight. Sometimes it appears as subtle monitoring, watching stories, asking about them indirectly, showing up in shared spaces. Times it appears as hostility, smear campaigns, attempts to provoke jealousy, efforts to regain emotional reaction. But at its core, obsession is about reclaiming narrative dominance. If the narcissist can provoke a response, any response, the illusion of influence is restored. If the empath reacts with anger, tears, longing, or even curiosity, the narcissistic psyche feels momentarily stabilized. I still matter enough to move them. But when the empather remains steady, the obsession deepens. Because now it is not just about the relationship, it is about identity. The empath's indifference becomes a silent contradiction to the narcissist's grandiose self-concept, and contradictions create psychological tension. Two must also consider something more human beneath this. The empath may have represented the closest thing to authentic intimacy the narcissistic individual has experienced. Not perfect intimacy, not fully reciprocal, but closer than most. Losing that can awaken an old, preverbal fear, the fear of being fundamentally alone. Yet instead of consciously grieving, the narcissistic defense converts grief into pursuit. It converts longing into strategy. It converts vulnerability into control tactics. The tragedy is that obsession prevents integration. True growth would require sitting with the loss, reflecting on one's own patterns, acknowledging harm, tolerating shame without collapsing into it. That is slow, painful work. Obsession feels active, it feels powerful, it feels like doing something. But it is avoidance disguised as intensity. And here is the final irony. The more the narcissist obsesses, the more they confirm the empath's clarity. Because obsession reveals dependency. It exposes the very fragility the narcissistic persona attempts to conceal. Well, for the empath, distance often brings increasing peace. For the narcissistic individual, distance can amplify rumination, not necessarily because they want reunion, but because they cannot reconcile being left. Obsession is not proof of love. It is proof of destabilization. It is the psyche's attempt to undo a reality that cannot be undone. When an empath walks away and does not look back, they become a living reminder that control was never absolute, admiration was never guaranteed, and superiority was never secure. That reminder lingers, because the hardest loss to accept is not losing someone you used. It is losing someone who proved you are not as untouchable as you believed. And if we follow this all the way down, past the loss of supply, the collapse of control, the injury, the shattered mirror, the failed replacements, the dysregulation, the obsession, we arrive at something much quieter and much more existential. We arrive at the void. Every defensive structure, no matter how sophisticated, is built around avoiding a core pain. In narcissistic adaptation, that core pain is often a profound sense of unworthiness. A belief formed early, reinforced repeatedly, that love must be earned through performance, dominance, or superiority, not received freely, not experienced safely, earned. The grandiosity, the control, the charm, the image management, these are not random traits. They are scaffolding built around that wound. When the empath walks away and does not return, that scaffolding weakens, not immediately in visible ways. The narcissistic individual, they still appear confident, still perform competence, still attract admiration. But internally, something begins to echo. Because the empath represented a rare contradiction to the narcissistic worldview. They offered love without needing to dominate tasks. They offered depth without competing. They offered presence without demanding performance. When someone like that leaves calmly, clearly, permanently, it confronts the narcissistic psyche with a terrifying possibility. Perhaps I am not unlovable. Perhaps I am unwilling or unable to love in return. That is an existential threat. It shifts the narrative from others fail me to I may be the common denominator. And for a personality structured around avoiding shame, that recognition feels annihilating. So what happens instead? Often, the mind resists this awareness fiercely. It doubles down on superiority. It seeks louder admiration. It pursues bigger achievements. It reinforces the image, but none of these fully silence the echo of the empath's departure. Because what was lost was not just a partner, it was proximity to authentic connection. And authentic connection exposes emptiness in a way casual admiration does not simply loneliness. It is the confrontation with the self that has been constructed but not fully inhabited. It is the awareness that external validation cannot permanently soothe internal insecurity. It is the subtle realization that admiration without intimacy feels hollow. This is why success, attention, and new relationships may temporarily distract, but do not fully satisfy. The empath's absence lingers not because of romance, but because of meaning. For perhaps the first time the narcissistic individual was offered a relationship where being seen did not automatically lead to abandonment, at least not at first. And when that opportunity dissolved, it exposed something deeper than wounded pride. It exposed a pattern, and patterns, when glimpsed even faintly, threaten identity. The existential dimension of this experience is profound, because at its core, the question becomes, who am I without the mask? And that is not an easy question for anyone. For someone who has relied heavily on image for psychological survival, it can feel unbearable. Some will avoid this question entirely, spending a lifetime reinforcing the mask. Others may, in rare cases, begin to confront it. Slowly, painfully, with resistance. Growth is possible, but it requires dismantling defenses that once ensured survival. The empath cannot force that growth. The departure cannot guarantee transformation, but it can initiate the crisis that makes transformation necessary. And this is where the psychological hell truly resides, not in revenge, not in dramatic regret, but in quiet awareness. The awareness that control cannot manufacture connection, that admiration cannot replace intimacy, that performance cannot substitute for authenticity. When an empath walks away, they take with them more than attention. They take the opportunity to remain unconscious. What remains is a choice: continue reinforcing the illusion or confront the void. And the void, however frightening, is the only place real identity can begin. Because in the end, the greatest punishment is not losing someone who loved you. It is realizing that love was offered, and you did not know how to receive it.